The birthday candles were still standing untouched when my 8-year-old granddaughter quietly stepped beside me and changed the course of my life. "Grandpa." Her tiny voice barely rose above the laughter drifting across the backyard. I turned from the guests, smiling as I looked down at Emma. She was clutching the edge of my sleeve so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Unlike the other children running around with balloons and paper plates, she wasn't smiling. "Can I tell you something?" she whispered. "Of course, sweetheart." She leaned closer until I could feel her breath against my ear. "Mom and Dad are going to ask you to sign papers today." I frowned. "Papers?" She nodded nervously before glancing toward the patio, where my son Daniel and his wife Lauren were entertaining guests with forced smiles that suddenly didn't look quite as genuine. "They said after cake, before Aunt Sarah gets here, they don't want you reading everything." For a second, the entire party disappeared. The chatter, the music, even the warm summer breeze. All I could hear was my own heartbeat. "What exactly did you hear?" I asked carefully. Emma swallowed. "I wasn't supposed to listen, but they were talking in the kitchen this morning. Mommy said you forget things now and wouldn't notice what you were signing. Daddy laughed and said they'd explain everything after everyone relaxed." She looked at me with frightened eyes. "I thought you should know." At 72 years old, I'd learned that children rarely invent details like that. Adults lie. Children usually repeat what they've heard. I rested a hand gently on her shoulder. "You did the right thing." "Are you mad?" "Not at you." She finally managed a small smile before running back toward the other kids, though she looked over her shoulder twice as if making sure I wasn't angry. I stood alone beside the lemonade table. For the first time that afternoon, my birthday didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like the opening move of a game I hadn't realized I was playing. My name is Richard Collins. For 43 years, I owned a respected construction company in Pennsylvania. I wasn't a billionaire, but I'd built a comfortable life brick by brick, project after project. Every dollar I owned had come from early mornings, long winters and weekends spent on job sites instead of vacations. When I finally retired, my wife Margaret and I believed we'd earned a peaceful life. Apparently, someone else believed we'd earned something for them. Growing older teaches you many lessons. One of the hardest is discovering that people slowly stop asking what you think. Instead, they begin deciding what you must be thinking. Forget your reading glasses once. Someone jokes about memory. Miss a doctor's appointment. Suddenly people exchange concerned looks. Leave the oven on one evening because the phone rang. Now everyone wonders if you're slipping. Those tiny moments become evidence. Evidence you never knew was being collected. About 6 months before my birthday, Daniel invited Margaret and me over for dinner. He called it a family planning conversation. At first it sounded thoughtful. Responsible even. Lauren served homemade lasagna, Daniel poured expensive wine, and after dessert she placed a thick blue folder on the dining table with a smile that felt just a little too rehearsed. "Dad," Daniel began carefully, "we've been thinking about the future." Margaret squeezed my hand beneath the table. Neither of us interrupted. "We just want to make sure everything is protected if, well, anything ever happens." I looked at the folder but didn't touch it. "Nothing's happening," I replied with a chuckle. My last physical came back better than most men 20 years younger. Daniel forced a laugh. "I know this isn't about today." Lauren slid the folder a few inches closer. "It's just being prepared." I remember looking at that folder, then looking at my son. For the first time in my life, I couldn't tell whether he was trying to protect me, or preparing to take something that wasn't his. I didn't open the blue folder that night. Instead, I pushed it gently back across the table. I appreciate the concern, I said, keeping my voice calm. But your mother and I already handled our estate years ago. Daniel's smile stiffened for the briefest moment. I know, Dad. Then what's this? Lauren answered before he could. We just thought another opinion couldn't hurt. Another opinion. Funny how harmless words can hide dangerous intentions. Margaret finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. Our attorney reviews everything every few years. If anything needs updating, she'll let us know. For a second, no one at the table said a word. Daniel forced another smile. Of course, we just wanted to help. I nodded politely, but something about the conversation stayed with me long after we drove home. Not because they wanted to discuss estate planning. Families do that. It was the timing. The rehearsed smiles. The way Lauren kept watching my reactions instead of listening to my answers. And the way Daniel seemed disappointed that I hadn't even opened the folder. That feeling stayed in the back of my mind for months. Until Emma whispered those words at my birthday party. Now everything suddenly made sense. I found Margaret inside the kitchen arranging fruit on a serving tray that didn't need arranging. She always did that when she was worried. Can we talk? I asked quietly. She looked up immediately. What happened? I waited until the screen door swung shut behind us. Emma just warned me. Margaret frowned. Warned you about what? I repeated every word Emma had whispered. With each sentence, the color slowly drained from my wife's face. When I mentioned the papers. When I mentioned someone coming after the cake. When I mentioned Aunt Sarah. She slowly placed the serving spoon onto the counter. So she whispered. They're actually doing it. You believe Emma? Margaret looked at me as though I'd asked the world's easiest question. Richard. That little girl has never lied to us. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Outside, everyone was laughing. Someone had turned up the music. Children were chasing bubbles across the lawn. From inside the kitchen, it almost looked like the perfect family gathering. Only now I knew better. What do we do? I asked. She folded her arms. The one thing they won't expect. And what's that? We don't confront them. I blinked. You want to pretend we know nothing. She nodded. If they're planning something, they'll only reveal everything if they think you're still walking into their trap. I'd spent 4 decades negotiating construction contracts. I dealt with dishonest suppliers, crooked inspectors, developers who tried changing agreements after the ink dried. But Margaret had always been better at reading people than I was. If she believed pretending was the smartest move, I trusted her. All right, I said. We play along. A faint smile crossed her face. Exactly. A few minutes later, I walked back outside carrying a fresh glass of iced tea. Daniel was standing beside the grill pretending to help one of our neighbors. The moment he noticed me approaching, he straightened his shoulders. Having a good birthday, Dad. The best. I smiled warmly. I've been thinking about what you mentioned a while back. His eyebrows lifted. The paperwork. Yeah. He tried very hard not to look excited. We figured today might actually be convenient. I suppose it could be. Relief flashed across his face so quickly he probably thought I hadn't noticed. We'll just keep it simple, he said. Nothing complicated. After cake. He nodded immediately. If that works for you. It does. I even patted him on the shoulder before walking away. Behind me, I heard him quietly exhale, like a man who believed the hardest part of his plan was already over. He had no idea that every word he said was making Margaret more certain than ever that Emma had told us the truth. As I reached the patio, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. A dark blue sedan had just pulled into the driveway. A sharply dressed man stepped out carrying a black leather briefcase. He wasn't family. He wasn't a neighbor. And he definitely wasn't there for birthday cake. The man looked toward Daniel. Daniel gave him the smallest nod. The stranger nodded back. I didn't know his name yet. But I knew one thing. The real birthday surprise had just arrived. The man in the navy suit carried himself like someone who belonged in a boardroom, not at a family birthday party. His polished shoes barely touched the gravel as he walked toward Daniel, offering a professional handshake before scanning the backyard. He smiled politely at a few guests, but it was obvious he didn't know a single person there. I watched from across the lawn while pretending to refill my drink. "That's him," Margaret quietly said as she joined me. "You know him?" "No, but I know exactly why he's here." The man never wandered toward the buffet. He didn't grab a soda. He didn't introduce himself to anyone. Instead, he stayed near the patio, checking his watch every few minutes like he had an appointment. Because he did. An appointment with me. I leaned toward Margaret. "I think it's time to call Sarah." She nodded immediately. Unlike Daniel, our daughter Sarah had never cared about inheritances or property. She had built her own career as a financial consultant in Washington and had always insisted we spend our retirement enjoying ourselves instead of worrying about leaving money behind. I slipped into the garage, where the noise of the party faded enough to make a phone call. She answered before the second ring. "Happy birthday, Dad. We're about 20 minutes away. I need you to listen carefully." The excitement in her voice disappeared instantly. "What's wrong?" I told her everything. Emma's warning. The mysterious lawyer. The planned meeting after the cake. By the time I finished, the silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Finally, Sarah spoke. I knew something felt off. "You did. A few months ago, Daniel asked me strange questions." "What kind of questions?" "He wanted to know if you had ever updated your trust." I frowned. "You never mentioned that." I didn't think much of it then. I just told him it wasn't my business. Another pause. Then her tone became serious. "Dad, don't sign a single page." I wasn't planning to. "Good." She lowered her voice. "When we arrive, don't tell Daniel we've spoken." "I won't. I'm bringing Mark inside with me." My son-in-law Mark had spent nearly 25 years working as a state investigator before retiring. If anyone could quietly observe people without attracting attention, it was him. "I have another favor," I said. "Anything. If something feels wrong, I want you two nearby. You don't even have to ask." Before hanging up, she added one final sentence. "And Dad." "Yes. I'm proud of Emma." "So am I." When I walked back outside, Margaret was waiting with her phone in her hand. "I already called Linda." I smiled. "Our attorney." Linda Brooks had represented us for nearly 2 decades. She had written every legal document we owned and knew our finances better than anyone outside our family. "What did she say?" Margaret sighed. "She told us exactly what we expected. And if someone you've never hired shows up asking you to sign legal papers." She looked directly into my eyes. "Walk away." I chuckled. Simple advice. The best advice usually is. Margaret hesitated before continuing. She also said if they pressure you today, it could be considered an attempt at financial exploitation depending on what's inside those documents. Those words landed heavily. Financial exploitation. Not family disagreement. Not misunderstanding. Something much darker. The afternoon rolled on. Neighbors laughed over old stories. Children chased each other through the sprinklers. Someone started serving slices of watermelon. To every guest there, it looked like the perfect family celebration. Only 4 people knew the truth. Margaret, Sarah, Mark, and me. Well, 5, if you counted one brave little girl quietly coloring on the patio while keeping one eye on her parents. Every so often Emma would glance toward me. Each time I'd smile and give her a reassuring nod. She'd smile back. Around 3 o'clock, Sarah and Mark finally arrived. Sarah hugged me tighter than usual. "Happy birthday," she whispered into my ear. "We're ready." Mark shook my hand. His smile never changed, but his eyes quickly scanned the backyard before settling briefly on the man in the navy suit. "So that's him," Mark murmured. "You recognize him?" "No, but I've seen plenty like him. Professional, confident, patient. The kind of man who made uncomfortable conversations sound perfectly reasonable." As everyone gathered around the cake table, Daniel looked unusually relaxed. Lauren laughed a little louder than normal. The lawyer checked his watch one last time, before slipping quietly toward the hallway leading inside the house. He believed everything was still going according to plan. What none of them realized was that the people they intended to deceive had already prepared a trap of their own. And in just a few minutes, someone was going to walk into the wrong meeting. The applause faded as everyone finished singing "Happy Birthday." I blew out the candles in one breath, earning a cheer from the guests and a playful kiss on the cheek from Margaret. To everyone else, it was another happy family memory. To me, it felt like the countdown had reached 0. People began helping themselves to cake, while children raced toward the dessert table. Emma stayed close to Margaret instead of joining the other kids. Every now and then, she looked toward her parents with worried eyes. She knew something important was about to happen. She just didn't know what. Almost 10 minutes later, Lauren appeared beside me carrying 2 cups of coffee. Her smile was warm. "Too warm." "Richard," she said sweetly, "when you have a moment, Daniel and Mr. Carter are waiting in your study." So that was his name. Mr. Carter. "The paperwork won't take long," she added. "Just a few routine updates." I accepted one of the coffees without taking a sip. "No problem." I smiled. "Lead the way." Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Margaret give me the smallest nod. Sarah casually picked up her phone. Mark quietly drifted toward the hallway without drawing attention to himself. Everything was in place. The study had barely changed in 30 years. The walnut bookshelf I built by hand still stretched across the far wall. Old family photographs sat beside engineering awards from my construction days. In one corner stood Daniel's childhood baseball trophy. I remembered handing it to him after his first championship game. He had hugged me so tightly that day. Standing in that same room now, I wondered where that little boy had gone. Mr. Carter stood as I entered. "Mr. Collins." He offered a practiced handshake. "Happy birthday." "Thank you." His grip was firm, confident, the handshake of someone who expected cooperation. Daniel closed the study door behind us. Lauren remained standing beside him. No one offered me birthday wishes anymore. The atmosphere had changed completely. Mr. Carter opened his leather briefcase and removed a neatly organized stack of documents. "I'll keep this brief," he said. "We've prepared several updates designed to simplify your estate planning while protecting your family's future." He slid the papers across the desk. I looked at them without touching a single page. "What kind of updates?" He spoke smoothly. "The first document grants your son authority to assist with financial decisions, should you ever become unable to manage them." "Assist?" "Exactly." He smiled. "A simple precaution." Daniel quickly added, "It's really just to make life easier if anything ever happens." I nodded thoughtfully. "And the rest?" Mr. Carter turned another page. "The remaining documents transfer ownership of certain real estate assets into a family trust." "A trust controlled by whom?" He hesitated only briefly. "You initially." "And later?" He looked toward Daniel before answering. "Eventually, your beneficiaries." "Interesting." "Very interesting." I slowly picked up the documents. Instead of skimming them, I began reading every line. Silence filled the room. The only sound was the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway. After several minutes, I reached a section buried deep inside the paperwork. There it was. Exactly what Emma had unknowingly saved me from. A clause allowing Daniel to assume broad authority over nearly every financial decision, if I were declared mentally incapable. Another section gave the trust control over our home. One paragraph, hidden among pages of legal language, allowed the trustees to relocate Margaret and me if they believed we required alternative living arrangements. Alternative living arrangements. What an elegant way to describe forcing someone out of their own home. I looked up slowly. Daniel couldn't meet my eyes. Lauren suddenly became very interested in the bookshelf behind me. Only Mr. Carter continued smiling. "You've prepared quite a thorough package," I said calmly. "We pride ourselves on being comprehensive." "I'm sure you do." I closed the folder carefully. Then I leaned back in my chair. "I have one request before I sign anything." Daniel's face brightened. "Of course. I'd like my wife." I paused deliberately. "And my daughter." Another pause. "And my son-in-law to join us." The room went completely still. Daniel's smile vanished. Lauren blinked twice. Mr. Carter adjusted his tie for the first time since entering the room. "Is that really necessary?" Daniel asked. I smiled pleasantly. "It certainly is. This concerns the entire family." For the first time that afternoon, I saw genuine fear appear in my son's eyes. Because in that single moment, he realized the meeting was no longer under his control. Daniel hesitated. For just a moment, I saw the confident mask slip from his face. "Dad," he said carefully, "this is really just routine paperwork. There's no need to turn it into a family meeting." I smiled as if his suggestion deserved consideration. "Maybe." I folded my hands on the desk. "But this house has belonged to our family for over 30 years. If I'm signing documents that affect it, everyone who grew up here deserves to understand exactly what's happening." Lauren quickly stepped in. "We're only trying to help." "I'm sure that's what you'll tell everyone." Before either of them could respond, I stood and walked to the study door. I opened it. "Margaret, Sarah, Mark, would you join us for a minute?" Within seconds, they entered the room. Margaret stood beside me. Sarah remained near the doorway, her phone resting casually in her hand. Mark quietly leaned against the bookshelf, watching everyone without saying a word. Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. This feels unnecessary, he muttered. No, Margaret replied calmly. It feels overdue. Mr. Carter cleared his throat. Perhaps I should begin by explaining the purpose of these documents. Excellent idea, I said. But I'd appreciate one small favor. He nodded. Certainly. I'd like you to read the relocation clause aloud. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. I'm sorry. The paragraph discussing alternative living arrangements. Silence. Daniel shifted his weight. Lauren looked toward the window. Mr. Carter glanced down at the paperwork before answering. That clause is standard legal language. I'm sure it is. I smiled politely. So reading it shouldn't be difficult. The room became painfully quiet. Finally, Mr. Carter adjusted his glasses and began reading. In the event that the trustees determine the current homeowners are no longer capable of managing independent living. He paused. Please continue, Margaret said. The trustees may authorize relocation to a suitable assisted care residence, while assuming responsibility for management and disposition of the property. No one spoke. Sarah finally broke the silence. So let me understand this. She stepped closer. If Dad signs these papers. She looked directly at Mr. Carter. Daniel could eventually decide Mom and Dad shouldn't live in their own home anymore. Mr. Carter answered cautiously. The trustees would have legal authority under specific circumstances. And the trustees are. He hesitated again. Your brother and his wife. Sarah slowly turned toward Daniel. You planned this. Daniel raised both hands. It's being taken completely out of context. Lauren nodded quickly. It would never actually happen. Margaret folded her arms. Then why include the clause? No answer. I leaned forward. Exactly. I turned another page. There seems to be something else. Mr. Carter remained silent. This section transfers majority ownership of the house into the trust. Daniel finally spoke. It's for tax reasons. Really? I looked directly at him. So if I cross out that paragraph, I tap the relocation clause and remove the ownership transfer. I smiled. The documents still accomplish everything you wanted. Neither Daniel nor Lauren answered. That silence said more than any explanation ever could. Sarah slowly pulled out her phone. I'm recording this now. Daniel's head snapped toward her. You can't do that. I already am. Mark finally spoke for the first time. I suggest everyone chooses their next words very carefully. His calm voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades interviewing dishonest people. Mr. Carter looked from one face to another. The confidence he displayed only minutes earlier was disappearing. I believe there may have been a misunderstanding. No, I replied quietly. There wasn't. I placed the folder gently on the desk. I understand these documents perfectly. I looked directly at my son. You believed age would make me careless. Then I looked at Lauren. You believed a birthday party would distract me. Finally, I turned back toward Mr. Carter. And you believed legal language would hide what ordinary English made obvious. Nobody denied it. Nobody even tried. Because the truth was sitting on the desk between us. Signed by no one. Exposed for everyone. Then, just as the silence became unbearable, a small voice came from the hallway. Grandpa. Every head turned. Emma was standing just outside the partially open study door. She looked frightened. But this time, she wasn't afraid of getting into trouble. She was afraid that the people she loved were becoming strangers. And what she said next would leave the room completely speechless. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Emma stood quietly in the doorway, clutching the little stuffed rabbit she'd won earlier at the party's ring toss. She looked from her mother to her father, then finally at me. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Lauren immediately rushed toward her. "Honey, this isn't a conversation for children." Emma didn't move. Instead, she looked directly at Daniel. "Daddy." Her voice trembled. "You said Grandpa wouldn't remember." The room froze. Daniel's shoulders stiffened. Lauren reached for Emma's hand, but the little girl instinctively stepped backward. "I heard both of you," she continued. "In the kitchen." Lauren forced a nervous smile. "You misunderstood, sweetheart." Emma slowly shook her head. "No. You were talking before everyone came." She looked at me. I didn't want Grandpa to be tricked. The silence became unbearable. Sarah lowered her phone only long enough to wipe away a tear before continuing to record. Mark folded his arms. Margaret gently walked over and stood beside Emma. "You don't have to be scared," she said softly. Emma looked up. "Am I in trouble?" Margaret knelt until they were eye level. "No. You told the truth." Then she kissed Emma gently on the forehead. "You were incredibly brave." For the first time all afternoon, Emma smiled. "Only a little. But enough." Daniel finally broke. "Emma." His voice cracked. "You shouldn't have listened." The words had barely left his mouth before he realized his mistake. Sarah stared at him in disbelief. "That's your response?" He looked helplessly between all of us. "I mean, she wasn't supposed to hear." "No," Sarah interrupted sharply. "The problem isn't that she heard." She pointed toward the documents lying on the desk. "The problem is that you said it." Daniel opened his mouth again. Nothing came out. Mr. Carter quietly closed his briefcase. The polished confidence he'd walked in with had disappeared. "Mr. Collins," he began carefully, "I believe it's best if I excuse myself." "You seem eager to leave." He gave an awkward nod. I wasn't aware of the family's internal disagreements. I couldn't help smiling. "This isn't a disagreement." I gently tapped the paperwork. "It's evidence." He swallowed. "I prepared these documents according to my client's instructions." "My clients." I repeated the word slowly. "So your clients weren't me?" "No." "You never represented my interests." "No." "You represented theirs." "Yes." Sarah stepped forward. "So you brought legal paperwork transferring my parents' home to a birthday party." Mr. Carter had no answer. Mark finally pushed himself away from the bookshelf. "I spent 26 years investigating financial crimes." Everyone turned toward him. "I learned something during that time." He looked directly at Daniel. "Most dishonest people don't think they're villains. They convince themselves they're helping. They invent reasons. They justify shortcuts. They tell themselves they'll never actually use the power they're asking for." He nodded toward the relocation clause. "But honest people don't ask for authority they never intend to use." Nobody argued. Because nobody could. Daniel's shoulders slumped. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I looked at him. How was it supposed to happen? His eyes filled with tears. "You'd sign. And then." Silence. I waited. "So tell me, what happened after I signed?" Lauren quietly began crying. Daniel rubbed both hands across his face before finally answering. "We were going to update everything gradually. Gradually, so it wouldn't upset you. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You mean? I spoke slowly. You plan to take control one document at a time. Neither of them answered. They didn't need to. The truth had finally spoken for itself. I carefully gathered every page of the paperwork and handed the entire stack back to Mr. Carter. I won't be signing anything today. He accepted the folder without resistance. I understand. No. I looked him straight in the eye. I don't think you do. I paused. Because this meeting isn't over. Everyone looked at me. I walked toward the study door and opened it wide enough to hear the laughter still coming from the backyard. My friends, my neighbors, my relatives, they all came here to celebrate 72 years of my life. I turned back toward Daniel and Lauren. And before this day ends, I think they deserve to know exactly what almost happened inside this room. Daniel's face turned pale. Dad, please don't. I held the doorknob for another moment. Then I looked at Margaret. She gave me a calm nod. She didn't need to say a word. After 47 years of marriage, I already knew what that look meant. It was time to stop protecting the people who had tried to betray us. And with that, I stepped out of the study and walked toward the backyard, knowing that the next 5 minutes would change our family forever. The backyard was alive with conversation. Neighbors balanced paper plates piled with barbecue. Children chased each other between folding tables. Someone had started another playlist, and soft classic rock drifted through the warm afternoon air. None of them had any idea what had just happened inside my study. I walked toward the center of the yard with Margaret beside me. Behind us came Sarah and Mark. A few steps farther back were Daniel and Lauren. Their faces told the story before I ever spoke. Guests gradually noticed. Conversation slowed. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. My sister-in-law looked at me with quiet concern. One of my former business partners raised an eyebrow. Something was clearly wrong. I picked up my glass of iced tea and gently tapped it with a spoon. The familiar sound echoed across the yard. Everyone turned toward me. I'd like to say a few words. The backyard fell completely silent. I smiled warmly. First of all, thank you all for coming today. I looked around at faces that had been part of my life for decades. Some of you helped me build my business. Some of you watched my children grow up. And some of you have been neighbors long enough to know exactly how badly I burn hamburgers. A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. The tension eased. For a moment, then I took a slow breath. But today, something happened that I can't ignore. The smiles disappeared. I've always believed birthdays are about gratitude. They remind us how fortunate we are to still have people who love us. I paused. Unfortunately, I also learned today that not everyone celebrates for the same reason. Several guests exchanged confused glances. I continued calmly. This afternoon, immediately after cake, I was invited into my study to sign what I was told were routine legal documents. Daniel lowered his head. Lauren closed her eyes. They weren't routine. The yard became completely silent. I held up the folder. Inside these papers were legal provision that would eventually give control of my finances. I turned another page. And even my home. To someone else. Gasps spread through the crowd. An elderly neighbor whispered. My goodness. I wasn't finished. I was encouraged to sign these papers during my own birthday celebration. I let that sentence settle. Fortunately, I smiled toward Emma, who was standing beside Margaret. One very brave little girl warned me before I ever picked up a pen. Every eye turned toward Emma. She looked embarrassed and hid behind her grandmother. I reached out and gently rested a hand on her shoulder. She heard something that didn't feel right. Instead of staying quiet, she chose honesty. And because of her courage, I'm still the owner of my own home. Nobody spoke. Not one person. Then my longtime friend Harold, who had known me since we were apprentices in the construction trade nearly 50 years earlier, stepped forward. "Richard." His voice carried genuine disbelief. "Are you saying someone here actually tried to trick you into signing those papers?" I nodded once. "Yes." He slowly turned toward Daniel. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Deep disappointment. Around the yard, similar expressions appeared on nearly every face. My neighbors, former coworkers, family friends, people who had watched Daniel grow from a little boy into a grown man. No one looked furious. They looked heartbroken. Sarah finally stepped forward. I recorded the entire meeting. She held up her phone. Every explanation, every document, every word. No one questioned her. They didn't need to. Daniel's silence confirmed more than any recording ever could. After nearly a full minute, Daniel finally looked at me. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, I'm sorry." Real tears rolled down his face. I convinced myself I was protecting our future. I looked at him quietly. "Our future." He nodded. "I thought." He struggled to continue. "I thought inheritance would eventually come anyway. So you decided not to wait." He couldn't answer. Lauren quietly wiped away tears. "We made the worst decision of our lives." Margaret finally spoke. "No. You made hundreds of small decisions. You ignored your conscience every single time. And eventually, they became this." No one argued with her. Because she was right. I looked around one last time at everyone gathered in my backyard. My birthday isn't ruined. In fact, it reminded me of something I've spent my entire life believing. A person's greatest wealth isn't their house. It isn't their savings. It isn't their investments. It's discovering who will protect you, when protecting you costs them something. I smiled down at Emma. And today, I found the richest person in this entire family. Emma smiled shyly. The guests began applauding. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just long enough for one little girl to realize that telling the truth had been the right thing to do. And as the applause faded, I already knew one final decision still had to be made. One that would shape the future of our family for years to come. No one rushed to speak after the applause faded. The backyard, which had been filled with laughter only an hour earlier, had become almost completely silent. Even the children sensed that something important had happened. They stayed close to their parents, whispering instead of playing. I looked around at the people who had shared so many chapters of my life. Some had worked beside me for decades. Some had watched Daniel and Sarah grow up. Others had simply been good neighbors, who always showed up with a casserole whenever someone on the street was sick. They had all come to celebrate my birthday. Instead, they had witnessed the truth. I set my glass down on the table. "I don't want a day to end with anger," I said calmly. "I want it to end with clarity." I turned toward Daniel and Lauren. For 72 years, I've believed that trust is the most valuable thing a person can earn. I paused. It takes decades to build. and only a few minutes to destroy. Neither of them looked up. Lauren quietly wiped tears from her face, while Daniel stared at the ground as though he hoped it would open beneath his feet. I love my son, I continued. That hasn't changed. Several guests looked surprised. But love doesn't erase consequences. It never has. It never should. Daniel finally lifted his head. Dad, I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough. No, I replied gently. It isn't. He nodded slowly. I understand. Later that evening, after most of the guests had gone home, only our closest family remained. The balloons swayed gently in the evening breeze. The paper plates had been thrown away. The yard was finally quiet again. Inside the house, Margaret, Sarah, Mark, and I sat around the dining room table. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted after an emotional day. She looked peaceful, exactly as a child should. Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand. What are you thinking? I looked toward the living room where Emma was sleeping. I'm thinking about the future. The following Monday, we met with our longtime attorney, Linda Brooks. She carefully reviewed every document Mr. Carter had presented. After nearly an hour, she removed her glasses and sighed. You were fortunate that you stopped to read everything. I almost didn't. She nodded. That's exactly what these kinds of situations rely on. Together, we updated every part of our estate plan. Every account, every property, every legal document. The existing trust remained in place, but several important changes were made. Sarah was appointed as the person responsible for carrying out our wishes, because she had never once tried to influence them. A separate education and future trust was created for Emma, one that no one else could access or control until she became an adult. It wasn't about rewarding one grandchild over another. It was about protecting the child who had protected us. Over the next several weeks, Daniel called many times. At first, he tried explaining. Then he apologized. Eventually, he simply asked for a chance to meet. I wasn't ready. Some wounds heal with time. Others require proof that someone has truly changed. Trust isn't rebuilt with words. It's rebuilt with choices. Whether Daniel ever earns that trust again is a chapter that hasn't been written yet. Emma still visits nearly every other weekend. She helps Margaret water the flowers in the garden. Sometimes she sits beside me in my workshop while I build little birdhouses or repair old furniture. One afternoon, she looked up from her coloring book and asked, Grandpa, are you still sad? I smiled. Sometimes. She thought about that for a moment. Are you sad because Daddy made a bad choice? I nodded. Partly. She climbed off her chair and wrapped her little arms around me. I'm glad you still have your house. I laughed softly. So am I. But do you know what I'm even happier about? She shook her head. I still have a granddaughter who knows the difference between right and wrong. She smiled so brightly that it chased away every painful memory from that birthday. Looking back, people often ask me what I almost lost that afternoon. Most assume the answer is my home, or my savings, or everything I'd worked for. They're wrong. The greatest thing I nearly lost was my faith in family. Thankfully, one courageous little girl reminded me that integrity doesn't depend on age. It doesn't depend on wealth. And it certainly doesn't depend on power. Sometimes, the strongest person in the family is the smallest one in the room. As for me, I still wake up every morning in the home Margaret and I built together. The front porch still catches the morning sun. The workshop still smells of fresh-cut wood. The family photos still line the hallway. And every time Emma visits, I remember something no legal document could ever change. A house can be protected by locks. A fortune can be protected by lawyers. But a family's true legacy is protected by honesty. On my 72nd birthday, I almost lost everything I owned. Instead, I discovered who truly deserved to inherit the values I had spent a lifetime trying to build.